Hello, everybody. So welcome to today's podcast. We're very fortunate today to be joined by Dr Dara Mojtahedi. That's how you pronounce it, Dara, yeah?
Perfect, mate, yeah.
Dara is a good friend of mine, and he's currently a senior lecturer in psychology at the University of Huddersfield. He teaches psychology on the undergraduate provision there and also investigative psychology on the master's course. Dara, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
No problem at all.
Would you mind starting by telling us a little bit about yourself? So what's kind of your research expertise? What sort of research have you been involved in the past? Yeah, just give us a bit of insight to who you are.
Yeah, sure. So the route I came up was very much psychology with an applied focus in the forensic and investigative element of the discipline. I did my master's in investigative psychology, as you did, and then met you at the PhD stage. And my PhD focused on eyewitness memory, and in particular, it was on evaluating eyewitness memory. You know, identifying factors that could tarnish eyewitness evidence. Through my PhD, I specialized my research into this idea of co-witness influence, or for people that read the academic literature, many call it memory conformity, which I'm happy to explain in a second. From that, I developed my research. I started publishing within this field of eyewitness influence. And I also branched out in many ways. Now I consider myself more as an applied psychologist. I like to apply psychological theory and research to real world settings and applications. And I like to do research that has some practical utility, whether that is to investigators or within a completely different domain, such as healthcare or sports.
Okay.
But yeah, the main focus of my research, what I like to consider myself as specializing in, is this idea of eyewitness evaluation. And I say that because whilst interviewing eyewitnesses is just as important, I was always more fascinated with the reasons for why witnesses and just human beings make crucial errors in their memories rather than just how to interview them. They do go hand in hand. But through my work, I've been able to develop multiple different research projects and just study the different ways that our memories can play tricks on us.
Okay, yeah, and I guess that's what we're interested in here in the context of eyewitnesses. So you mentioned this concept of co-witness influence. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? How does it work? What does it involve?
Yeah, so perhaps the best way to start that is if I give you a case study or an example. So let's talk about the Jill Dando murder, for example. So Jill Dando, for those of you who would remember, it was a Crime Watch, I believe it was called, a Crime Watch presenter. I don't know if they still show that. I used to watch it as a kid. Terrified me. But yeah, she was a presenter and she was murdered on a doorstep, and the offender fled the scene. Numerous witnesses turned around and said to the police, you know, look, we saw someone suspicious leaving that area. We think it was the assailant. So what the police did was they said, well, okay, perfect. We've got these witnesses. Let's chase the investigation forward. They eventually found a suspect who they thought was the offender. They were certain of it. His name was Barry George. Now, Barry wasn't the offender. We know that now, but the police thought he was the guy. So they thought, we've got some witnesses. Let's have a look. Let's see if the witnesses can identify Barry in a suspect lineup identification parade. Now, for those of you who aren't too aware, you would have seen it in the movies. An identification parade, typically you bring the witnesses in, you have your suspect, and then you place him alongside other individuals who look somewhat like him. You normally have around 6 to 8 in total in the lineup in the UK, and the others are called foils. They're not other suspects. Some people think you get a list of suspects and see which one's the guy. That's not the case. You get the one suspect and people that you think look like him. The reason for this is to make sure the witnesses aren't just picking someone who looks like the suspect, but the actual suspect. So they did this with Barry George. They put him in a lineup. Also, despite what movies suggest, most lineups aren't live. They're pre-recorded videos or images. But they did this with Barry George, and they brought the witnesses in, and they said, Can you identify the person who you saw on the night of the crime? Now, here's the thing: the majority of the witnesses said no. They said nobody here is the person we thought was the person that we saw, except one. There was only one person who did point at Barry George and said, you know what? Yeah, he is the guy I saw fleeing the scene. He is the offender. But one wasn't enough, as you know. The police weren't going to ride on one. But this is where the police made the crucial mistake. They let the witnesses go home, and on that night, several witnesses shared the same cab to the train station. Now, during this taxi journey, one of the witnesses in there was the one who thought Barry George was the offender. The others were the ones who said, no, he's not the guy. But they talked in this taxi journey home, and it appears that that one witness who thought Barry George was the person had some influence on them. Why? Because the next day, what happens? Now we've got multiple witnesses changing their mind, going to the police and saying, on second thought, Barry George was the guy that I saw. One witness went from saying the suspect's not in the lineup to I'm 90% sure it's Barry George. He was wrongfully convicted. Fortunately, his conviction he was exonerated, I think, a year later, or maybe even less than a year. But that's a great example of how witnesses were just influenced. And that was an example of how they could be influenced in identification. They can also be influenced when just giving a statement. I won't go into too much detail of it, but the Oklahoma bombing case was another example where one witness convinced multiple witnesses that there were multiple assailants taking the van that blew up, where it was only one person. And this led the police to go on this really expensive manhunt looking for this second assailant who never existed, because one witness, again, influenced the others. So this is co-witness influence. And what it relates to is this. So what we're talking about here is something that we call post-event information. Post-event information is when a witness encounters new information about the crime afterwards. So we get this all the time. You can encounter post-event information through the media. If it's a high-profile case and you've not been interviewed yet, the news may report information. You may encounter post-event information from police officers. Sometimes police officers accidentally reveal additional information to the witnesses when they're interviewing them. Sometimes they've done it on purpose to try and jog their memory, which is bad practice. But the most common source of post-event information is other eyewitnesses. You see, one study by Kebbell and Milne, they just surveyed previous witnesses, and they found that 86% of witnesses admitted to talking to other co-witnesses before being interviewed.
Wow. Was this it's a UK-based study, or was it US-based, that one?
It was UK-based, this study.
Wow.
It was UK-based. And it's to be expected. I mean, put yourself in a situation, right? You've just witnessed, we don't witness crimes on an everyday basis on the streets. Maybe where you're from, they do, but normally, I say that I'm from London as well, so maybe similar. But the idea is we witness it. Now, when we do witness a crime, it's not usual. We're normally in shock or confused. So we're not just going to stand there in silence and go home or wait for the police. We're going to talk. So it does happen. Now, most of the time, it's fine. We've seen the same thing, talk, nothing happens. Sometimes when this happens, if the witnesses hold different recollections, well, the recollection of one can contaminate the recollection of the other. And if one of these individuals holds misleading information, well, now we're contaminating each other with misinformation. And that is co-witness influence. It's this idea of one person's information contaminating the statements of others.
So to be clear then, it's not necessarily about what, well, in fact, it appears not to be the case at all, that a witness is intentionally attempting to deceive or influence other witnesses. It seems to be, from what you've just described, more of an accidental process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, don't get me wrong. There can be scenarios where somebody may want to contaminate people purposely. Maybe they have a vested interest. Maybe they're trying to protect someone or blame someone else. You know, but generally speaking, witnesses don't realize that they're wrong and that they're contaminating someone. They often genuinely believe that their recollection is correct, and that's to be expected. I mean, human memory is not as robust and as accurate as people think. It's heavily flawed. You know, we all make mistakes. Sometimes these mistakes are significant and they can have huge effects.
And I guess those huge effects are things like wrongful convictions, or I guess wrongful acquittals on the basis of inaccurate eyewitness testimonies?
Absolutely. I mean, on the first hand, they slow down an investigation. Police officers investigators don't just use witness statements to convict. They use it to drive the investigation forward and find out what's happened. If incorrect information is distributed here, well, they're going to go down the wrong road. And as you said, it can also lead to the correct offender getting away with it. So here's an interesting statistic. The Innocence Project, they obviously, as you know, they look at exonerating falsely convicted people through DNA evidence. And within their first 325 exonerations that they did, they reviewed these cases, and 75% of these cases involved eyewitness misidentification. That's not the main issue. The issue is that within these cases, in 48% of the cases of this misidentification, the real offender continued to commit crimes. Now, when we're thinking about that, a lot of these crimes were sexual violence or homicide. That's worrying. When we know that half of these cases result in the offender being allowed to commit more and more crimes. So what you're essentially doing is you're placing more victims at risk of being targeted.
And I guess this is one of the reasons why in the UK we've had quite stringent procedures post PACE, so the famous PACE legislation, Police and Criminal Evidence Act, that attempts to, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that put in place, part of the reason for that was to attempt to kind of standardise and regulate some of these procedures to reduce the effects of erroneous eyewitness testimonies having a detrimental impact on cases?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it also applies to the PACE and the PEACE model, which was a framework that came out of it. It was applied to witnesses and suspects. And without going down the wrong route, one of the reasons was that they acknowledged that biases from investigators could influence both witnesses and suspects. A big reason that they did this as well was if we compare it to the Reid model that they still use in America to interview suspects. That's one of those methods where you're probably going to get a confession. You're probably going to get what you want to hear, but it's not going to be the truth. And the PACE model, the idea behind it was look, we're not just looking for evidence to convict, we're looking for the truth. So absolutely, it was kind of it was all about do your research, follow a systematic guideline, and try and avoid any form of contamination. The PACE model does relate more to investigators influencing the witnesses, but absolutely.
I wondered whether I seem to think, and I could be wrong on this, that the PACE and the PEACE, I think probably the PACE legislation wasn't a part of that about preventing investigators from having an eyewitness pass a suspect being brought out in handcuffs who then goes into a lineup that they're to identify who in the lineup they believe to be the suspect. I think there was some element of it that regulated kind of the interaction with eyewitnesses. I think there was some rule brought in, was there not, that suggests that actually the police investigators that are leading an investigation are not those that facilitate the eyewitness identification and lineup procedures in order to reduce any contamination or influence. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, and there's a reason behind that. There have been so many cases where an identification has been done, and then they later found out that the witness saw the actual offender in the media, in the news. That's a big problem, and sometimes we can't control. Okay, we can control it in terms of whether the witness sees the suspect in person, but in some serious crimes, the suspect's the image is going to be published before the witness makes an identification. Now we've got big problems again. They are only in the really high-profile cases where the media reaches it, but yeah. With identification, that's been seen to have a huge effect, and the reason for that is in fact, it's one of the explanations for memory conformity. It's the same reason. We call it source monitoring errors. When we remember information, we sometimes forget the source. So what you get is somebody looking at a face and going, that looks familiar, that I've seen that face before, but they cannot identify why that face is familiar, and they misattribute the source to be the event. And that's yeah,
that makes sense. And so bringing it back to the co-witness influence stuff, then I know you've conducted a series of studies and you've got a number of publications in this area. What did you do to try and kind of test the influence that co-witnesses can have on one another?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, the area has been heavily researched. I picked an area to look at that's been done a lot already, which was fun. But one thing that interested me was that a lot of the studies, they use different methodologies. Some of them were a bit flawed, in my opinion. To give you an example, some of them used rather than using real co-witnesses, they said, here's a statement that a previous witness had said. And they saw if this had an effect. Whereas I wanted to look at co-witness discussions. So what I did was I created an experimental design, and my motivation, my influence of this was the famous Ash Solomon line study. I always found that fascinating. I've always been fascinated with social psychology, and for those of you who maybe are a bit rusty on this study, really simple. He sat participants down in groups and he showed them these lines, and he said, which one of these lines is the same size as this target line? And the answer was so easy. The answer was A, let's say. But the other participants were Confederates or actors, and they were instructed purposely lie and say it's a different answer. And what he found was that the majority of these guys, real participants, would be influenced by these Confederates, and they'd give the wrong answer. So I wanted to get that idea and adapt it, and place it into an eyewitness design. So what we did was simple. We had witnesses come in groups. We manipulated group size. That was one of the variables. And they just viewed a crime, a CCTV footage of a real fight. It was an assault that took place in a bar in, I think South Africa. Really simple video. A bar, people are playing pool. Suddenly a fight breaks out, and you've got these two key individuals, and they're very distinguishable from one another. One's got this light yellow t-shirt, one's got this really dark green t-shirt. And I need to remember this, but if I'm not mistaken, the man in the dark top attacks the man in the yellow top. They're eventually broken up. There's a bit of a scuffle, they're broken up. And then the witnesses are asked, what happened? Describe what happened. And what we're looking for is to see, what I wanted to see was who they blamed. You see, a lot of research in memory conformity had found that we conform to each other, but on small pieces of information, such as hair color. It's not small, but not significant. Or what kind of shoes was the individual wearing? I wanted to see, would witnesses be influenced into blaming the wrong person, the innocent person? So that's what we did. So they viewed the crime, and then I said to them, right, guys, I'm going to leave the room. All I want you guys to do is to discuss what you've seen. Now, unbeknownst to the participant, the other participants around them were Confederates, just like Solomon Ash. These were actors, volunteers I brought in. I gave them instructions beforehand, and I said, lie. All I want you to do is to say that the wrong person, the person who was actually attacked, did the attacking. That was it. They had a discussion, and then I interviewed them, and that was the main framework. But obviously, throughout the course of my research, I manipulated so many different variables to see what would increase or decrease the chances of memory conformity. What we found was that yes, some, but not all, participants were conforming, and this has been referred to, this niche area is referred to as blame conformity, because now you're not only just conforming about memory, you're actually attributing blame. And this was quite worrying, because what this showed was that eyewitnesses can blame an innocent person for a crime if others around them suggested that that was the case.
Fascinating. It really is. So what do we think's happening there then? Do you think are they genuinely, is their memory being impacted and contaminated to the point where they now wrongly believe the wrong person who's committed the crime, or are they conforming on the basis that they know that's untrue, but they're going with it nonetheless?
Yeah, great question. That's what everyone always asks. Okay, so there is not one explanation for this memory conformity. There are two essential ones, and these are the two that researchers explained, and I'll quickly just go through them. Okay, one of them, intentional informational influence. It's this idea of we want to be correct. So when we hear other people say something and we believe that they're more likely to be correct than us, we accept their information as reality. This happens in everyday life. It happened in the Ash study. It's informational influence simply says if we believe another source, whether that's one person or five, are more likely to be correct than us. then we may be influenced or be motivated to take their answer and accept it as being the truth. In the case of an eyewitness experiment, they want to be correct. They don't want to be wrong. So they're going to conform. You know, if they think the source are more likely to be correct. When there's multiple people, when there's 4 against 1, you're more likely to believe it. You know, if me and you and 5 other academics are in a meeting and somebody asks us a question and you think the answer is A, but the rest of us say the answer is B, you may think, well, what are the odds that 5 other academics are wrong? Well, I guess it depends on the academics. You know, but that's one explanation. The other explanation is unintentional. This is due to source monitoring errors, which I mentioned before. Just to give, without going too much into cognitive science, just to give you an analogy, what one research study found is that many people have a misunderstanding of how memory works. They think memory is like a camera or like an iPhone camera. What I mean by that is you record an event and it's stored, and then when you want to recall it, you find it, you press play, and it plays. The idea is that they think memory for events are stored as one piece of information, and we have one piece for every incident. In reality, it doesn't work like that. Memory is a reconstructive process, and what I mean by that is we remember fragments of the incident, and when we come to recall the incident, we try to find as many pieces of fragments and piece them together. Like a jigsaw puzzle. So in your head, you've got these jigsaw puzzles, and when you try and remember an event, you try and piece them together. What happens when people do this is they sometimes include incorrect jigsaw pieces to post-event information. Now, normally, we can tell where the source is and tell them apart. But sometimes when the information is so similar to what we witnessed, we misattribute it as something that we learned from the crime. So essentially, we're remembering the post-event information, but we're misremembering where we learned it. So these are the 2 different explanations. And what researchers have found is they were able to prove both, because in one study, what they did was they presented participants with this post-event information, and then they interviewed them half an hour later. But when they interviewed them, they said to them, by the way, guys, that post-event information we showed you was completely incorrect. Don't include it into your memory. Include what you remember, because we gave you false information. Some participants were still including the false stuff because they mistook it for information they learned. But just one contribution that our research made, was that we were able to show that it is in fact an intentional process as well. And the reason we showed this was, in one experiment, exact same design, they viewed a crime with one other co-witness who was an actor, but we manipulated how the actor was presented. In one condition, we didn't tell him any information about the actor, just another co-witness. In another one, they were presented as a PhD student. And in another one, they were presented as a police officer who was taking part. In other words, we said, guys, what's your occupation? Please say it out loud. So I guess they said, I'm an officer. What we found was that when this co-witness was presented as a police officer or a PhD student, these undergraduate participants were far more likely to conform than when none of this information was given. And this goes to show there was some intentional process. They looked at them and said, that person is either really intelligent or really credible. I'm going to take their answer. So it is both effects.
It really is fascinating stuff. And the authority figure, it dawns on me that there's some sort of overlap in the process, the cognitive decision-making process going on, to that which is similar in the jury deliberation room, whereby an authority figure takes on the lead role as jury foreperson, or otherwise commands authority based on their version of events, that, you know, how they see and interpret the case, and other jurors succumb to that version of events, and they subscribe to that kind of narrative of the story. So do you think there's this mechanism, this process, do you think it definitely operates outside of witness scenarios as well, in that there's, you know, people are conforming in a whole range of settings to figures of authority?
Yeah, oh yeah, massively. In fact, what I really wanted to do is, moving from here, is apply this more to the juror setting, which potential future research discussion for us. Because let me make this clear. I think this effect is even stronger within jury cases, and the reason for that is this: in an eyewitness setting, witnesses give their statements privately, right? They don't have to agree publicly with the other co-witnesses. Therefore, they're not subjected to normative pressures to conform. Normative pressures to conform are basically pressures to conform for social approval and to avoid any social scrutiny. Within a juror setting, you are discussing the incident with people around you. So there's an additional social pressure, not just informational influence, but you also have this this normative pressure to conform. So in my opinion, I think social influence is extremely stronger within juror settings, especially if you have certain jurors that have got low self-esteem and others who are more extroverted and more authoritative. And it's dangerous when you think about it, because what this means is it will only take 1 or 2 jurors to influence 6, 8, way more individuals. And it's something that needs to be controlled for in some way.
Yeah, it dawns on me as well when you're listening to you speaking there that a number of characteristics, individual differences between jurors may be at play there. The notion of, levels of egocentricity, narcissism, the idea that you're right and you're not, in all honesty, the kind of Donald Trump phenomenon that I'm not interested in other informed views. My view is the only view that I'm going to listen to. And depending on, I guess, your social status or your occupation or whatever that kind of authoritarian figure is determined by the other jurors. Like you say, it can be interacting with other jurors being low in self-esteem. It can have such a detrimental impact, but also a very varied impact on the ultimate decision that jurors make between cases. I.e., you get, a random compilation of 12 people together. We actually value this random compilation aspect in England and Wales in our jury trials. But you get a separate random compilation of jurors, put them together, and we could, get a completely different verdict, I guess.
Absolutely. I'm sure when I was looking at some of your earlier work as well, when you did multiple juror trials, some were guilty, some were not guilty, and they were kind of showing different majorities as well, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and again, we tried to track through some of the individual characteristics to see whether that can, there's this notion of individuals making decisions, but then how those characteristics interact. So despite observing the same case, different factors and predisposed inherent characteristics among the jurors appear to predict different decisions despite observing the exact same case. So yeah, there really is. It's fascinating how this kind of, I guess at the core of this, despite the fact we're honing in on jury decision making or co-witness influence, at the core of this is what you mentioned at the beginning, this kind of cognitive decision information processing mechanism which is ultimately fallible and impacted, contaminated by a range of different factors. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, that's where it gets tricky, but also exciting for researchers, because there are so many different variables that we have to look into, control for. It's never just one factor. And it's the most important thing to say is there's always an interaction between dispositional factors, so inherent personality, views, and situational factors, what others are saying around you. And the combinations are always going to have an effect, and yeah, it is worrying to some extent, because I mean, let's say hypothetically you've got a rape case and you've got one juror who's got very strong rape myths, but he holds very strong rape myths, but he is very assertive, very argumentative, and you've got another set of jurors who are somewhat submissive, low self-esteem, low perceived intelligence. What you're likely to get is that the jury might reflect this one guy's opinion rather than their own opinions. So yeah, it's very interesting area to look into.
So that leads me perfectly on to my next question then, which is, what do you, so you've described some really fascinating research in the past that you've carried out in relation to co-witnesses. You described a range of things that you're interested in moving forward. What are your kind of future research plans? What would you, in an ideal world, what will you go on and kind of test in this area next?
Yeah, so in this area, I mean, like I said, it's so heavily researched already. What I'm working on at the moment with some colleagues at the University of Huddersfield is we're trying to test the exact same model, but through a far more rigorous methodology that aligns more with cognitive science, using multiple trials. But more importantly, what we're looking for at the moment is an interesting one. We're looking to see whether our facial representations of what a suspect looked like can be influenced. So what we're doing is we are presenting participants with a diverse range of faces, again, to make sure it's try to find different faces. And what we're doing then is that they learn the faces, and then they encounter misleading information. And then they're asked to either describe what the target looked like, or then we give them a lineup to see if they can make an identification. But what we're doing is, in terms of the misleading information, we're looking at implicit and explicit examples. And one thing we're looking at is photo fit drawings. So as you know, when you witness a crime, you sometimes there's a photo fit drawing released to see if this is the person. What we're seeing is if witnesses view a person and then we present them with a photo fit picture with a slight piece of misinformation included. For example, the eyebrows are much bigger, like mine. When it comes to showing them a lineup, are they likely to just pick someone with big eyebrows, or are they likely to remember it? We did some preliminary research, and what I found was that if they read a previous statement that quite simply said the witness had a nose piercing when she didn't, or the suspect had blue eyes when he really had brown eyes, the majority of witnesses, when I later asked them what color was the suspect's eyes, they went, "Oh, it was blue," or the majority did. What we're trying to see now is to what extent can this influence actual legal processes, such as making an identification or providing a statement. So that's the next step forward for us. But we're also trying to do this rather than doing one trial. We're using loads of different faces. We're using much larger, in cognitive research, you don't just do one trial, you do multiple trials. And what we're trying to say is, I mean, for example, my previous research, it was one video. Someone can argue, well, maybe that one video was just misleading. So we're trying to create many different trials and see, right, we found this through research, but can we apply this to real life even more? Can we be more confident that this happens in identification parades? So that's the next
wow, it really is interesting stuff, and the real world application and implications are just vast, aren't they, in terms of policing, accuracy, trial outcomes, the whole range and remit of kind of criminal justice implications are vast. Another question, I guess, a final question before we wrap up for you is, for any undergraduate or master's students that are looking to, they're interested in the area of eyewitness testimony and perhaps co-witness influence specifically, do you have any kind of recommendations or gaps in research that you know of that you think is kind of a doable study that you would recommend for that stage of study?
Absolutely. So one thing I'll say before I say that is don't be put off if research has already been done. We have this big reproducibility crisis in experimental research. There's always ways to contribute by tweaking the variables investigated, or replicating the study with a more robust methodology. So never let that put you off. In terms of research out there is loads. I think personally, looking at factors of social influence amongst witnesses, there's still a lot of need. There's so many different sources of misinformation that we can manipulate. That's the first one. The other thing I would always advise students to consider looking at is the type of misinformation. I mean, a lot of these studies have shown that witnesses can be saying they saw a can of Coke rather than a can of Sprite, and to some extent that's interesting. But to the other extent, so what? Can that apply to different settings? So a cool thing to do, I wouldn't say it's cool, maybe to me, is to look at what facial features can be manipulated by post-event information and what can't, because some can't. If you view a suspect who is Caucasian and then the misinformation says that he was Asian, you're probably less likely to believe this, unless your memory is really that bad. So look at that. And the reason I say look at facial misinformation is because at the moment, running experiments is not possible, or depending on the university you're at, it's questionable because you might not be allowed to do face-to-face interaction. Currently, there are really good, easy ways to do these kind of eyewitness experiments online. You can even, I've used Qualtrics before. They've got functions there. You can even use a program called PsychoPy, which sounds like a really difficult thing to use, but I guarantee you, it's you download it, it's free. You look at some YouTube tutorials, and you will be able to design your own online experiment within a matter of maybe a few days. hard studying. And facial recognition and identification are easier to do in these in these settings. I always say as well, if anybody, you can provide it, Dom. If anybody ever wants to do eyewitness research but needs some ideas or to discuss an idea in more detail, I'm always happy to talk to people. So just drop me an email, and I can always advise you depending on your own individual needs of what you want to look at.
And do you, I guess, to take that to the next level, look very briefly, are you in a position and willing to supervise PhD students on some of the topics you've described there?
Yeah. If the student is motivated, if they're motivated, and I feel like they have the scientific prerequisites to do it, I'm more than happy. I mean, everybody who studies forensic psychology, they want to do murder investigations. They want to do interviewing offenders. The eyewitness stuff is kind of like the C thing for people, because it's not as exciting. It's not as rock and roll. So anytime someone says to me, I'm going to do a postgraduate research project on this, music to my ears. Absolutely. Yeah.
Excellent,
absolutely.
excellent. And so anybody interested in finding more about your research, Dara, they can go to, you've got a ResearchGate profile, and they can find all your publications listed there. And I guess they can also just Google Dr. Dara Mojtahedi at University of Huddersfield and get your staff profile there as well, right?
Yeah, if you can spell my second name, by all means, try and find it. I'm on Pure, I'm on ResearchGate. I'd say I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't think I've used it for like 5 years. I'm pretty sure there's still an image of me looking in my early 20s.
And I know you did a range of. I remember reading some of your kind of more public access articles where you give a bit more of a lay, accessible description and explanation of some of the things we've been talking about today. So I guess Googling you will bring up some of those articles if people are interested in reading them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's quite a few more public orientated pieces. But more importantly, if anybody ever wants further information, again, if you want, just email me. I'm happy to share what I've done so far, and hopefully it would be of some interest to people, or maybe inspire their decisions in dissertation choices.
Excellent, thank you. Dr. Dara Mojtahedi, everybody, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at the University of Huddersfield, and a specialist in evaluation of eyewitness evidence. Thank you, Dara. One final question I want to ask you before you go, and hopefully this is not something you're going to get sued for. You mentioned at the start about the Barry George case. I know it's quite a high-profile case. Do you believe that the what you described in terms of the co-witness evidence, do you believe that was the main, or at least an important factor in what happened in that case, or do you think it was a minor component?
My heart paced when you said, "Is this something you're going to get sued for?" But no, that's okay. I've not seen the facts of the case in good detail. I know. God, I can't. Fiona Gabbard. Is that the right name? Yeah, I'm having a block now. She's crucial in this area of research. She talks about that case quite a lot, especially she did in a PhD as well. But yeah, I've not seen the case, but I believe so. For multiple witnesses to go back the next day after this, I think it was crucial, and that's only one example. There's been so many different cases where they've been able to ascertain that was the reason why witnesses talking to each other. So yeah, I think it has got real world issues. It does affect real witnesses.
Thank you. Okay, amazing. Thank you, Dara. Thanks for your time. Look forward to catching up with you soon.
Cheers. See you later.
Cheers then. Bye bye.